Today I'll be defending my controversial view that influencers actually do a very difficult job. Maybe not very difficult, but they do have a difficult job. And that job is to sell you something. Now, let's get this straight. Influencers are nothing but glorified salespeople. All they do is sell. They rely on brand deals for money. They rely on promoting products for money. They must sell you something to survive. And since brands will only spend money where they know they can get something back, they must be very good at selling something to you. But why? Why is that? Why are they so good? We don't trust our car salesmen. We don't follow them on Instagram. We wouldn't listen to their recommendations. But we do with influencers. Why? It's actually quite simple. It's because no one trusts a brand. If a brand is saying, hey, we're the best, you'll go, yeah, of course you have to say that. You have to sell yourself, right? But if your friend says, hey, this brand is really good, you're more likely to listen. And that's what influencers are. They're your friend. Or they're your guru. They will brand themselves as fashion gurus, as leaders in this niche that they carve out. It has similar fundamentals to word of mouth marketing, right? Same thing. If your friend comes up to you and says, hey, you should try this, you're more likely to try it compared to conventional advertising. And lastly, it's because their content doesn't feel like an ad. Their content is natural. It's shot on, usually their phones, and you volunteer to see it, which is the biggest thing. You volunteer. They don't blast it in your face. You chose to see that kind of content. And also, people can see whatever product it is in a natural environment. It's not in a studio environment. It makes it more real almost. Influencers are then just seen as authentic individuals who are simply reviewing a product. It's the equivalent of a car journalist reviewing cars. You're more likely to trust him because he's an established player in his field. And so now you're thinking, great, I want to be an influencer. Sure, of course. Who doesn't, right? Here are 3 things brands will look for when picking an influencer. So number 1 is they want someone with high engagement. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they have a high following, a high engagement. And usually smaller influencers tend to do better because they're more authentic and they're not, their audience isn't as used to selling them stuff. So this is where micro influencers kind of thrive in this aspect. Secondly, they want someone with a strong niche. It only makes sense if you're a fitness brand to be selling with fitness influencers. You don't want to be selling to someone who does like home decor or something, right? And the third thing is authenticity. This is actually quite difficult to come by. If you are an authentic influencer, or people view you as an authentic individual, brands would want to sort of piggyback off your authenticity. So what do influencers have to do? Now, influencers have to amass a large following in their particular niche, and they have to make sure that they're not too big because then they kind of lose touch with their audience, and then they start to suffer. They must brand themselves as experts, or at least educated in their niche. At this point, it's so saturated, most niches, that you have to be an expert or very intelligent in your niche. You have to be likable enough that people want to engage with your content. You have to be putting out content that people want to engage with. And you have to sell a new product or brand every other day because that's a paycheck. And you have to do all of this while remaining authentic and true to yourself. Put your hand up over Zoom. Let me talking like it's live. I'm assuming you'll put your hands up for this. Someone who is constantly selling you something. Would you trust that person? I wouldn't. Would you trust that person if they constantly change the thing they're selling you? So one day it's this vitamin, the next day it's this hair product. You can't trust them. I mean, you can, but it's a lot harder to. It's much easier to trust someone who sells you one thing, like a car, for example, but we don't. We still trust influencers. We still get influenced by influencers. It's a $1 billion industry for a reason. It's because it works. So why do people still follow influencers? Well, number 1 is because they're good at their job, which is essentially to sell you something, because they're glorified salespeople. Number 2 is that they will brand themselves as gurus in their particular niche. So you automatically trust their judgments and their recommendations more. Number 3 is that they'll provide you some kind of value to their audience. They'll give you fashion tips. They'll give you product recommendations. They'll give you something of value because the audience isn't there to follow them for their advertising. They're there because there's some kind of value that they're getting out of this influencer. And so to add to that, they'll make it seem like they're helping you when they do promote something, because they'll say, hey, this is something I use. This is a really good product that I use, and I know you'll want it as well. Here's a discount code to make it easier or to make it more affordable just for my audience. And so they build that connection with their audiences. The other thing is that influencers who are big enough have the ability to influence their entire niche. So, for example, any of the Kardashians, any of the Jenners, if they were to wear a new article of clothing, that would become a trend. They're trendsetters. And so a lot of people just want to follow them because they want to stay up to date with the most recent trends. These are actually the best people to sell products because not only are they setting the trend, it's much easier to sell their audience something because they're much more easy to influence. And finally, their content will blend into your feed and not make it seem like an ad. Because an ad is polished, it's uptight, it's very clean. But their content is much more organic, it's usually shot on their phones, and it seems to blend in much better with your feed. And so, to drive home this point about authenticity and why it's so important, we should look at some people who weren't authentic with their audiences. And so, an example of this is the YouTuber Aaron Marino for the channel Alpha M. Now, he runs a channel for menswear and men's fashion, and he has well over 4 million subscribers. But in 2018, he made a video where he compared his sponsors' watches movement to those of Rolex. And he said that it was his own opinion that a movement watch was better. Now, this was blatant promotion of a product that he, whether he believed it or not, is simply not true to the audience. They know that. They know that there's no way that a watch that doesn't have the same horology or the same history would be better than a Rolex. And what happens is they don't trust that person anymore. They don't seem to have the audience's best interest in mind. And so what happens is brands will no longer work with them. And this actually impacts the influencers more than the actual brands, because for a brand, it's very easy to find an authentic individual. For a brand, there's hundreds of Alpha M's out there. There are hundreds of Aaron Marinos. You just pick one and you go with one who has that connect with the audience. But for an influencer, they have to win back that trust. And that's a very difficult thing to do if you've lost it by blatant self-promotion. Now, in Aaron's case, he was able to build it back through other ways, but not everyone can do that. And so this brings me to something that I call the influence struggle. And this is where influencers have to be someone to look up to, right? If no one looks up to an influencer, they have no influence. And in order for someone to look up to you, you must be better than them in a certain aspect or in a certain niche. So in the realm of fashion, you must be better dressed than the average person for them to look up to you. And the issue with that is that influencers are always comparing themselves with other people, especially in a field that is so saturated now, where there's hundreds of fashion gurus, there are hundreds of fitness gurus out there, but they're always trying to one-up each other. And that brings the issue of self-image and what is achievable. What happens is now you're going to see influencers who will, in order to look better or be better than the average person in their minds, they have to buy things that they don't need. They have to do things to impress their audiences. They'll start taking out more risky financial decisions. They'll start buying more designer clothing. They'll start buying more luxury goods. And that's only to sort of project themselves in a certain way. Simply because that's the only way that they can grow their audience, or that's the only way it seems that they can grow their audiences. And so an extreme example of this is the Concord dandies. Now, these are people who live in the DRC who will live under the poverty line, but will be spending their money on designer clothing. And one of the most notable quotes was someone said, "I could buy a piece of land, but I bought these shoes instead." And that kind of highlights the shift that we're seeing now. I mean, obviously this isn't because of influencers per se, but the general idea that people are buying things that aren't necessarily good financial decisions simply to impress other people. And that's something that we're going to start seeing a lot of. So to end with, I thought I'd end with a quote from philosopher Kylie Jenner, who said that posting a selfie is hard because there's a lot of pressure. It just has to be perfect. And on first glance, people can sort of dismiss this, oh, it's, she's making it seem so difficult. But that's the pressure that these people are under. That's the pressure that influencers have to go through, where each and every selfie is under heavy criticism and heavy scrutiny from themselves and from the public. And that's why I think influencing is actually a much trickier and deeper subject than people give it credit.